Welcome to Treadmill Talks with Shannon Maves, a podcast for athletes and fitness enthusiasts to pass the time during mind-numbing cardio while I use my no-bullshit coaching style to educate, inspire, and entertain. I'm your host, Shannon Maves. Now let's walk and talk. Hello, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Treadmill Talks. Today's episode is the one about progressive overload. Progressive overload is a training principle in which you work to progressively increase the demand being placed on the muscle. And it is a concept that I wish I had understood much better earlier in my lifting career. Unfortunately, a lot of coaches do not teach this method, or they only teach it in its most basic form, where you train to simply increase the amount of weight that is being lifted. But there is much more to progressive overload than just increasing weight. If we were to only focus on increasing weight, then what are we supposed to do when we physically cannot increase weight anymore? Just accept that we've reached our peak? Fuck that. There are plenty of ways to work to continuously improve, which is exactly what I want to discuss today. Progressive overload, the training principle in which you work to increase the demand being placed on the muscle, not just the amount of weight. Can you work to increase the amount of weight in order to make progress? Of course. And when you're new to lifting, you can generally increase weight at a fairly quick rate. But this rate of progress is not linear. It's more of a logarithmic growth, meaning that the longer amount of time you've been lifting, the slower this rate of growth starts to become. It doesn't mean that it completely stops, but it does start to become slower and slower over time, which is why we need to come up with other ways to increase the demand being placed on the muscle so that we can continue to make progress. Let's say that we have been lifting 3 sets of 10. Doesn't matter what exercise. We're doing 3 sets of 10. And we've been able to increase the amount of weight that we've been lifting each time. Eventually, there's going to come a point where we cannot hit sets of 10 anymore because the weight has just become too heavy for us. What we can do instead is maybe keep the weight the same and work to increase the number of repetitions. So instead of doing 3 sets of 10, we work to do 3 sets of 11 or 12. This is going to increase the demand being placed on the muscle. Even though it is not working to push heavier weight, it is working harder to push the same weight more times. A similar method would be to increase the number of sets. Instead of 3 sets of 10, we could try adding in a 4th set or even a 5th set. Again, with this method, we are not working to increase the amount of weight, but rather keep the weight the same and perform more sets or repetitions. And if you work to continuously increase the amount of times you are pushing the same amount of weight, eventually you will get to a point where you can increase the weight. But you'd want to go back to that previous 3 sets of 10, and then you can work that weight up to 3 sets of 12 or 4 sets of 10, and so on and so on. This method of progressive overload is utilizing the concept of increasing training volume in order to make progress. Training volume is calculated by multiplying the weight times the sets times the repetitions. And when you think of it that way, it hopefully starts to become pretty clear that by increasing either sets or repetitions, you are thereby increasing training volume. And that you don't have to increase the weight in order to increase training volume. Now, another method of progressive overload is to either decrease rest times and or increase training frequency. The reason I've lumped these methods together is because they both work to reduce recovery time. And if a muscle has less time to recover, That means it has demand being placed on it more frequently, thereby progressively increasing the demand being placed on the muscle, which is what progressive overload is. Now, this method isn't utilized quite as often for a couple of reasons. One is that your muscles need time to recover in order to make progress. Doing more is not always better. But let's say you are an athlete who has been doing the same type of training for a while now. A while meaning like years and years, like a professional bodybuilder, for example. Your body is going to have a much higher threshold for training than someone who is just starting out. For example, someone who has never lifted weights in their entire life will most likely make progress training just 3, maybe even 2 times per week because it is a brand new stimulus to their body. But the longer they do it for, the more frequently they will need to start training in order to continue to make progress. Because, kind of like how increasing weight sets or repetitions, this progress is a logarithmic growth curve. And if they continue to just train 2 or 3 times a week, that progress is going to become slower and slower over time. So they may want to work their way up to training 4, maybe 5 days per week, maybe 6 days per week if they're like a professional bodybuilder or some type of other elite level athlete. But that's where this can get kind of tricky because you do still need rest in order to make progress. And if you just do more, then where do you go to continue progressing? Which is kind of the second reason why this method isn't talked about quite as much. Let's say that we were to try and start reducing rest times between sets in order to give the muscles less time to recover, thereby placing them under more demand more frequently. This method will work for a little while, but eventually we can't just keep cutting down the rest time because we'd get to a point where there would be no rest time between sets anymore. And then you would just be doing 30 repetitions instead of 3 sets of 10. And that's not the best way to make progress unless your goal is randomly to do as many repetitions as physically possible, which is cool, I guess, but it's not going to do much for increasing strength or body composition. But that's a whole rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down today. What I want to do next is talk about 2 of my personal favorite ways to practice progressive overload. The first one being increasing time under tension. And there are actually quite a few different ways to do this. Now, the most simple example would be to just slow down the movement. If you perform a squat at a normal tempo, great. But if you were to slow it down and perform it at, let's say, half the speed, all of a sudden, you are essentially placing the muscle under twice the amount of demand. So if you randomly don't have access to heavier weights, or maybe you've reached a mental threshold for the amount of sets or repetitions that you want to do, but you still want to work on making progress, just slow the fuck down and try some tempo reps. Try squatting down with a count of 1, 2, 3. Pause at the bottom for a count of 1, 2, 3. Or come up with a count of 1, 2, 3. Or try a combination of all of those. Another way to increase time under tension is to perform partial repetitions. This is actually also a great method for breaking past sticking points, but again, that's another conversation for another day. By performing partial repetitions, you are also placing more demand on the muscle by keeping it under more tension for a longer period of time. An example of this would be like 1.5 reps of squats. This would be where you squat down, come halfway up, squat down again, and then come all the way up. Doing 3 sets of 10 of those is going to be kind of equivalent to doing 3 sets of 15 since you're adding in an additional half of a repetition each squat. Another way to place the muscle under more time under tension is to keep it under constant tension throughout any given movement, meaning that you don't come all the way up or down to the point between repetitions where your muscle starts to relax, but rather you work through every rep with constant tension on the muscle. So, like for a squat, you wouldn't stand all the way up between repetitions. Or for a lateral shoulder raise, you wouldn't lower your arm all the way down between repetitions. For an RDL, you wouldn't lock out your hips at the top. Tempo reps, partial reps, and constant tension sets are all great ways to increase time under tension, which requires more demand on the muscles and are therefore a great way to practice progressive overload outside of just increasing weight or sets or repetitions. Now, the last method of progressive overload that I am such a fan of is working to improve form and mind muscle connections. Because when we start to put too much focus on increasing the weight, oftentimes our form starts to slip, usually out of our ego getting the best of us. It's not like our form is slipping intentionally. We're just excited about lifting more weight. So when we take a minute to stop and just focus a little bit harder on perfect form, and we work to really feel the appropriate muscles working, a lot of times you'll wake up the next day and be like, what the fuck? Why am I so sore when I did less weight than usual? It's because you did it correctly instead of letting your ego get the best of you and lifting sloppily just so you can say that you got a PR. And when I say working to improve mind muscle connections, this is a real fucking thing. There have been scientific studies done where they attach electrodes to different muscles during different exercises to study the amount of stimulation of that muscle when the person is just thinking about that specific muscle versus when they're just going through the motions. And when you simply think about the muscle that you are training, that muscle literally fires harder. It's been scientifically proven many times, which is why I am not afraid to grab my ass during kickbacks or close my eyes to envision my rear delts working. Physically touching the muscle or closing your eyes to envision it working has been scientifically proven to help you stimulate the muscle that you're trying to train, which is pretty fucking cool in my opinion. And it can help you to progressively overload and place the muscle under more tension. Now, progressive overload is almost always considered to be a resistance training method, but I actually apply this same concept to my nutrition coaching because the whole concept is about progressively increasing the amount of demand that is placed on the muscle. And I believe that we should progressively increase the mental demand of improving our nutrition as well. If you're brand new to training and you're doing 3 sets of 10 repetitions with body weight just 2 times per week, and you try to increase to 5 sets of 12 repetitions with 100 pounds 5 days per week, you're not going to fucking last. You're going to get burnt out and feel defeated and quit. So if you're brand new to any type of nutrition plan, I'm not going to sit here and tell you to eat nothing but whole foods with a perfect macro split and an exact amount of fiber and sodium and whatever else. I'm going to ease you into it and work to progress your plan as you go. This has been proven time and time again to be an unbelievably successful method for my clients, which is why so many of them have stayed with me for years and years. So if you're interested in working with a coach who doesn't expect or even want you to go from 0 to 100, then you can go to the show notes and click the link to apply to work with me. And if you liked this episode, please share it with your friends or even to your social media. I would also love it if you took just a second to give it a rating or review, and definitely give Treadmill Talks a follow so that you can help me get it bumped up higher across the podcast platforms. And Once again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for listening to Treadmill Talks. If this episode taught you something, lit a fire under your ass, or at least helped you forget how long you've been walking in place, please leave a review or take a screenshot to share on your social media. Don't forget to tag me at Shannon Maves so I can give you some love right back. And thanks again for listening to my Treadmill Talk.